This question I get from my students: Can African Americans be racist against white people? Is there a power dynamic necessary to be racist? That's a great question. I mean, I think one of the things is the lens that we take to what racism is. So if we see racism as just the predilection of individuals that enact a certain word or do something in one small micro context, then that of course, yes, if that's the limited way in which we define racism. But if you take Dr. Brown, the slide that Dr. Brown showed, where you see the kind of complexity to racism, the different ways in which racism is engaged at institutional levels, the capacity of racism to define people's lives, their material lives, the actual ability to live itself, is really the kind of substantive aspects of racism we want students to understand. But if we relegate racism just as a name calling or all those kinds of things, right. So the answer, I think you kind of, by asking the second part to your question, yes, there has to be a power dynamic that is attached to racism. There are these kind of micro dimensions of racism, but they're part of a larger puzzle. I could sit in my room and engage in kind of racist prejudices, but if those prejudices do not impact a person's ability to get a loan, to get a rating on their insurance, or what other aspects of their lives that will have a direct impact in a substantive way. We're seeing numbers, housing, school, education, all of healthcare. It kind of fades away, and we have a very micro interpretation. So I hope that answered your question. There are others in there, Dr. Brown or Dr. Berry.
Well,
You want to take it?
I was just gonna throw out that I think, there are different ways that people define racism, but I would also, I would agree that when we're thinking about racism in terms of its ability to categorically impact the life chances of whole populations, nations of people, then there has to be a power element that's there. And it's not just the power element of someone having power and then being able to wield it over you. It's having the power to literally control your ability to sort of move in and out of life, not just an individual, but large scale groups of people. And so I think this is why it's so important to help students to better understand the nuances between the different ways that racism can play out, so that they don't get stuck and believe that racism is just something that one person does to another person. It is, but it's more than that too. Okay, so we have a question about, this might be one for Dr. Berry. Well, this isn't really a question. It's really more about the normalization really of racism. So this person sees the connection between what Frederick Douglass said about slavery and how it corrupted not only those who were in power, really the power structure, but also those who it was those who were actually getting lynched, and then those who were in the larger society. And it creates generational racist social constructions where women and children saw, we talked about this, I think maybe last week. We talked, or no, we talked about it this week. We're going to talk about it this week, where you had lynchings and you had people, children, women, a whole host of folks who were able to see these, witness these lynchings. And they talk about, the person mentioned notes on the state of Virginia, which is what we talked about that last week. Okay, let's see. Oh yes, go ahead.
I want to add that I think it's true. There's ways it gets buried. This idea that slavery or even lynchings had an impact on those that lynched and those that were lynched, just like those that were enslaved versus those that did the enslaving. It had a negative impact on both groups, or both groups of people. And we see that it seeps out into historical records in very, very sort of subtle ways, and then some not so subtle ways. You'll see it in the personal writings, like you mentioned here on the notes in the state of Virginia. I've seen it in plantation records where enslavers are writing down. There's one record that I've got to write about one day, but he's looking at the work lives of the enslaved people, and he's describing all the different tasks that they're doing that day. And then on the right hand side of his ledger book, he's sort of has these religious chants where he's asking forgiveness like literally, like while he's managing the plantation on the same page, on the opposite page, he has all these sort of religious catechisms of just all these chants that he's saying, like, and he's repeating them over and over and over again, like the same sentence over and over and over again. And you see that throughout the whole journal. You also see it in their personal and their private letters. So with lynching, I think it harms. I think it harms everyone. I mean, one of the things I do with lynching, I don't like to always show the charred up Black bodies or the cut up and dismembered or, decapitated, castrated male bodies or female bodies that were raped and then lynched, or lynched then raped. I don't like to always show that. And so, like, I think the image that you guys saw, we purposely showed one that did not show Jesse Washington's body. That picture has been recirculated over and over and over again. And I think that act alone, I think seeing the crowd, seeing all the people that were willing to go and put on their Sunday dress and to be there and smiling in front of these bodies, that's to me a part of this conversation that gets missed. And what does it mean that there's souvenirs that are still passed down generations even to today? That there are kids who, I mean, I just have it in a class of mine where a student had, the skin of a purse full of skin of different ethnicities from his father or his grandfather. So, you see those kinds of things happening. And I do think it's destructive for both sides. And I always push against binaries, but I do think in that case, I can use that binary.
So we also have some comments of just recognizing that this is a history that was not taught. The person didn't who's here in our presentation it just learned about the Tulsa
Mhm.
massacre, and and it's not the only one that happened, right? We had
Mhm.
others in Florida. There were, right? So
St.
there are
Louis.
other places. Yes,
Mhm.
absolutely.
Yep.
Um, so let's see if we have some more questions. Let's see.
Also, there's the comment about, I asked earlier about words. I always say words matter.
Oh,
So, riot, massacre, uprising, and this kind of came up a few minutes ago when Dr. Anthony Brown was mentioning, or maybe it was Dr. Kathleen Brown, but mentioning what are people calling protesters today? Some people are talking about them as looters. Some people are referring to them as rioters. It's so there are people that are looting. Don't get me wrong, but it doesn't mean that everybody that's out marching, holding a sign, or going to a
mhm.
courthouse and protesting a decision. It doesn't mean that those individuals were also looters. So there's a way that people that are fighting for the rights have been criminalized, and I think that's highly problematic, unless they have committed a crime.
Right. And that's part of, but what we would likely say if we're thinking about this in the term in the context of race, um, part of that changing of language is a piece. It's connected to the stories that we tell about race, right? So you can't be a person who is actually trying to resist certain kinds of you know treatment that's inequitable or unjust. It has to be that you are um, not loving your country, or and those are that is how race in many ways gets constructed, which is why it's so important, as we're talking to students about these issues, that we don't sort of not address the fact that race is there, but we talk about how race is it's work that we do every day. Every day we are making race, right? We're making it not only matter, we and then there are these effects, as Dr. Anthony Brown talked about, real effects that are linked to them, to race. We have a lot of just sort of comments here. um let's see. Someone is writing about doing exercises in classrooms around redlining, which we hope to talk about hopefully a little later through this webinar series. But also thinking about how racism and power dynamics get connected to zip codes, where you actually can see how these racialized processes do impact people in a material way. Let's see, we may have some more. Do we have any more questions? Right. Oh, there's another, yeah, wonderful comment here about the difference between talking about those those of our sort of forefathers who were part of the Boston Tea Party, and how they were constructed versus perhaps how others get constructed today. Um, so, wondering if we have any other questions. Are
I
there
have a
any
question,
questions?
if I
Yes,
may.
yes, please. Yes.
Hi. So I'm actually not a social studies or a history teacher. I'm an English teacher, but I
Oh,
wanted to ask about following curriculum. So from what I understand in Texas, according to my really great friends who are history teachers, there's a certain curriculum that they have to follow. And I'm not sure about other schools, but according to my friends, the curriculum doesn't leave a lot of room for these kind of crucial and important things to be taught. And um, when you had mentioned earlier about some kids not being interested in history, to be honest, I moved to Texas when I was really young, and we learned like Texas history, then social studies, then Texas history, then US history. Then, we learned histories that I thought were kind of either redundant or boring versus learning about geography and the movement of people, which I think could have led to the idea of why people moved in a certain way. And, I just don't know, how do you, as a social studies department or a history department, how do you manage the like teach best practices concept without going too far off of what curriculum says and not getting in trouble
Mhm.
by your dean of academics, or not being on pace with what the tests say you should do? Like, what kind of suggestion would you give to history and social studies teachers? Because for me, for English, I do best practices, so I can use different stories
Yes.
as long as I teach the same teaks, but it's not the same, I don't believe, for social studies and history. So how would you suggest that we do start splicing in these more important concepts and historical events? Because I think that too would entice more students to be
Be
interested
involved.
in the histories that we teach. So sorry, that was very
No
long.
worries. Can I
I
can
mean,
I just say something really quickly? I was going to respond by simply saying that, and I hope Dr. Anthony Brown will speak to this. We did a study where we looked at how racial violence gets taken up in US history textbooks here in Texas. And actually, there are places where you can talk about this. I mean, Tulsa may figure in the curriculum. Part of it is how you'll present this work and making sure you actually get to that part of the history. But I'll let Dr. Brown, maybe he'll.
I think one of the things that we try and emphasize with teachers, pre-service teachers at University of Texas at Austin, is that your task is not to change. You can, of course, you have to learn subtle ways in which to bring different ideas that are often not presented in the standards, or just in the typical curriculum. However, I think one of the things that we emphasize, and even through these webinars, we're trying touching on topics that are addressed and giving a different perspective as it relates to that topic. So the three big ones you're going to find, particularly as they relate to African Americans, there's going to be a pretty substantive conversation about enslavement. I mean, it's there, it's present, but I think there's so many aspects of enslavement that are missing within it, even though the state has moved towards conceptualizing the Civil War and racism in a different way. I mean, slavery in a different way. The other, of course, is Jim Crow. It's there, it's present. Even lynching, even the term racial violence is in the standards, in the textbooks. So you have to, what we call mine, like thinking in terms of like an archaeologist. You have to be able to mine those parts where you want students to understand different concepts. It may mean in the end that they may not find out about who W.E. Du Bois is. They might, but the goal is not to say here's a catalog of people and things, and we have to get them in. It's to be able to take what's already there and provide different conceptual lens that has to engage those questions, whether it's World War II, African Americans fighting in World War II and coming back, and what life was like after World War II, after World War One. These are topics that are fairly substantive in the social studies curriculum. You just have to, even the Vietnam War, which teachers barely get to in the end. There's an aspect of race and history that is often not taken up, and that would allow students to engage the topics that are sanctioned by the state, but at the same time providing a
Yeah.
different lens to.
That's one of the reasons why we think understanding those key constructs in race, if you sort of understand key constructs in race, you will have a framework that you can use to highlight and to point out how those histories operate. And that's another way that you'd be able to help them to think about the implications of those histories, or how they make sense of those histories in light of where they are today. We found that that's a really useful um, way to look at documents, and it provides another avenue for analyzing the documents as well.
I know we have 120 seconds left
Yes.
about, but I
Do we have
wanted
any
to
other
say
questions?
something really quick, and I think it's incredibly important, and it's something that we didn't necessarily address, but I think it's important that we notice that biography is incredibly important when you engage these questions. So if you want to understand, if you're gonna like, I understand the four little girls, and even oftentimes you'll see like history websites will just say four little girls, or they'll say 16th Street Baptist bombing. But we never ever hear Ida B. Collins, Cynthia Wellesley, Carol Robertson, Carol Denise McNair. There's no name that's attached to it. And I think giving the humanity to lynching in that way, that real people, there's a person by the name of Gwendolyn Goldsbly that writes about this. She says biography is vitally important when we talk about something, she calls it the spectacular secret, lynching. Um, and this last thing I want to know, I put it in here. It's called Without Sanctuary. There's a book that's attached to it, just as a kind of a warning before you watch. It's rough. It's very rough. But I think there's another layer to its difficulty, is that all of the images were postcards that were made and collected and used in a very casual kind of way. They weren't used to portray lynching or say black people were less than. They were used just to say I had lunch last week with Uncle Bill and great to see you. And then you turn it over and there's Jesse Washington lynching. So I think we put that in to show the ways in which race gets taken up, particularly in the context of lynching.
I think we're out of time, but I will just say
Yeah.
that one way to answer the question that Francesca had was to think about it as what evidence you bring to teach that aspect of the teach. So you can bring in a variety of different things to cover. If you have to cover World War I, you can cover World War I, but then show different aspects of how people experience the war. You could show, the silent parade and people responding to lynching if you're talking about the context of the early 20th century. And I also will say that we're moving into a different, hopefully within the next 3 years, the textbooks are going to be very, very different. That they're making changes to think about issues that we've talked about today, and some of the stories that are often left out. Some of the major textbook companies are making vast revisions to their work. So I just wanted to say that if you're going to start doing this now, you're not going to be, you'll have a textbook to support it if that's the way you choose to teach, or you could just choose by teaching through primary documents. And I think that's always safe.
Are there any other questions? We probably have time for maybe one more before we need to totally wrap up. Anything else? Well, thank you all so very much for coming and attending, and we hope that you gain something from this workshop that you can use in your classrooms.
Thank you so much for
Yes,
spending
thank
the
you,
evening
everyone.
with us.
Thank you.